good afternoon or evening or morning to everyone who's here. It's really wonderful to have such interest for this event. There's 180 people signed up for this webinar, which potentially can become a problem because we only have a webinar subscription up to 100 people. If you're experiencing any difficulties, well, you're not since you're in the room, but just in case, we will be recording this session and it will be online shortly after the conclusion of tonight's discussion or talk. My name is Miriam Wistreich. I'm one of the curators behind ALT-CPH20, Patterns in Resistance. I'm part of the Laboratory for Aesthetics and Ecology. We're a curatorial collective, and we've curated this year's edition of this biennial, which is a Copenhagen-based biennial for artist-run and self-organized spaces. And this year's biennial focuses on the intersections of craft and the digital, and the politics of craft and digital technologies. So we've been looking into technologies of the home, craft work of the hand, and all of the stories untold and secret that we can find within those materials. And we've been lucky enough to have Raisa with us for some time. Raisa did a project with us for the biennial, special commission together with Kunsthalle Amsterdam, an Instagram essay, I think we can call it, Raisa, for the stories on Instagram. And you can, if you're interested, called Materializing. Oh, I've lost the title. Materializing Textile Labor. This will come to me in a second. I'm very sorry. But you can see Raisa's commission on our Instagram channel. It's in our stories if you're interested. And I'll just give a short introduction to Raisa's. Actually, no. First, I will say we have about an hour and a half. You're welcome to take breaks at any point. We will have about an hour, roughly an hour of Raisa telling us about her work. And then half an hour for questions and discussions at the end. You can send questions to me using either the Q&A function in the bottom of your screen or the chat function. And I'll collect questions and we can discuss at the end. We'd love your questions, so please do send them through. And we will try to stop to take breaks every 30 minutes, but of course it's a webinar and we can't see you. So please feel free to take breaks at any time if it's needed. I think that's about it. I will just quickly introduce you. Raisa, thanks so much for being here. Raisa is an interdisciplinary artist whose work addresses cultural anxieties surrounding nationhood, textile identities, and the cultivation of borders, as well as examining the encoded violence in histories of labor and globalized neo-colonial textile production. Kabir, this is a short bio. Raisa has done work across the globe, but partly her work has been, she's participated and exhibited work internationally at the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, the Tetley Art Gallery Leeds, Raven Row London, all in the UK, and at the Textile Art Center in the US. And Raisa has also lectured on her research on South Asian textile cultures at the Tate Modern, the ICA Institute of Contemporary Art, and the Royal College of Art, all in the UK. I think that's what I will say about you, Raisa. I'll just give the word over to you, and I'm going to attempt to take my own image away. I hope it works. Thanks so much for being here with us tonight, Raisa. We all look very much forward to hearing more about your work.
Thanks, Miriam. Hello, everybody. It's so great to share my work and have a chance to lecture. So what the commission that Miriam was talking about was called Materialising Textile Labour, Embodied Geographies of Weaving. So yes, you can find that. I think that's on my Instagram and on the Arts of Instagram as well. And that was I would call that a digital essay, and that was really trying to condense a lot of complex ideas through a kind of visual essay with montage and collaging and text. And a lot of those themes from that digital essay are going to be present in this short lecture. And I'm really just going to cover some bases around South Asian textile history and its relationship to Britain and Empire. And how there are two regions in South Asia that are of particular interest, that are on particular border areas and areas of conflict, and how each of these nations or cultural textiles are consumed and produced throughout history. And then I'm going to talk, we'll have a little break, and then I'm going to talk through my practice as an artist. I'm a weaver, I make textiles, but I also perform craft, and I use my body in various ways, and I build looms, and these are all works that are kind of encapsulating these textile histories that we're going to talk about shortly. Yeah, to kind of like transmit these stories that are held in the body, and how textiles are often, yeah, shown as very pretty, beautiful examples of delicate work happening somewhere and preserved somewhere, but are so removed from the body of the maker. And that's what my work's really about. Okay, so I'm going to share the PowerPoint, and I'm using a different laptop than I usually would, so I think it's quite bright, so I apologise if some of the colours drain from it, but it should be okay, hopefully. Okay. Okay, so this is one of the slides from some of the digital essays that we're creating. So I've called it Materialising Gendered Archives, Weaving Language and the Global Textile Object, mainly because a lot of this work and research has come at looking at archives. What kind of textiles are archived? Who are they archived by? Where are they held? Where are they held internationally? What gets kept? What disappears? We'll talk a little bit about that later, about what has been lost, and also what counts as an archive, and the various kind of types of ways that kind of indigenous or non-colonial ways of perceiving what an archive is. Okay, so I'm just gonna jump in. Okay, so I'm gonna start off with, right at the beginning, with John Forbes Watson. So he was a guy who is from Scotland, spent a lot of time in India, and, you know, trained as a doctor, and, you know, was milling around, and he found himself to be appointed director of the India Museum in 1850. And I'm sure a lot of you will know, around about this point in 1851, we had the Great Exhibition, and there was just a lot of amazing South Asian textiles. And I think people in the British textile industry were really jealous, or really felt that, like, oh gosh, how do we find out about how to teach our students, or how do we improve our textile design? Mainly to improve the textile design for selling textiles, but also for improving design techniques and patterns. But also it was a preconceived and calculated way of how to design textiles that imitate South Asian textiles to sell back to South Asia. So John Forbes Watson created these books in 1866, and They are a collection of 18 volumes, and it's a collection of 700 samples of textiles from every part of the geography of colonial India at the time, cataloguing techniques, styles, the way the clothes would be worn, materials, this kind of thing. And some of them, yeah, and this is the website. So all of them have been catalogued by the Harris Museums. You can go onto this site and you can look at every single example online. So I'm going to focus a little bit on these Kashmiri woven shawls. So here are some that are part of the John Ford Watson books, and these are, you can see they're cashmere shawls. And I'm sure lots of people will recognise this as something they call paisley pattern. And we now know that like paisley woven shawls are from Paisley in Scotland, and these shawls woven in Scotland were woven on jacquard looms, a mechanical loom that imitates the brocade weave technique you can see on your screen, that was being woven in areas of Kashmir, Punjab and Persia. And the pattern you see, the teardrop pattern, is the butta, and obviously has a lot of significance in that region and pattern making in that culture. You can see here they've called it pine pattern, they call it teardrop, they call it snake pattern. It's called lots of different names. But yeah, you can see we've got a piece from Punjab, a piece from Kashmir. Okay, so Kashmir is one of the first regions I'm going to talk about in relation to Bengal. So I've got two maps here. One is a kind of unmarked map. This is, you can see, yeah, these are various maps that look at when partition was created in 1905 and then in 1947 again. And Kashmir is a contested area. It's has the kind of hatched markings. Yeah, here's a clearer map. So you've got Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Kashmir. And Bangladesh initially was part of Pakistan. From 1947, it was called East Pakistan, West Pakistan, and East Pakistan. And then Bangladesh had its own civil war, liberation war, revolution, became an independent state. So these entire regions before these borders were put in place, including Myanmar, Burma, was part of British India. And India is a colonial construct anyway, because a lot of these regions would have been grouped ethnically, people of so many different languages, cultures, religions, some people living side by side, some people South India being completely different. I'm going to just focus on Kashmir and Bengal. I can talk about lots of different parts and lots of different regions and techniques, but this is what I'm going to focus on today. So Kashmir is a contested site. Pakistan wanted it, India wanted it, Kashmir wanted to be independent. But this is the place where those paisley shawls were first found. And initially, the Kashmir is made from the goat that lives high up in the mountains. They were very plain, really, really plain. And the trend for the highly patterned shawl emerged when lots of colonial officers would send them home back as like presents. And the patterning became more and more popular. And then it began to be, it became larger and it became increased. And then by the time paisley was being woven to make really cheap imitations in Scotland, they again elongated the pattern, created it for the European market. But yeah, so and here's some more paisley patterns. And so this type of weaving is called brocade. And so every single colour is done individually with its own spool. And you imagine the amount of labour, the amount of time it takes to create these pieces. And true brocade can only be done by hand. It cannot be done by any machine. And jacquard machines are looms that lift individual threads, but there will be floats. So brocade means there are no floats, and every spool is done individually in every column. Okay, so we've got a little text here. Oh yeah, me and Miriam put together a selection of texts if you want to read anything after this. And they're going to be put up on the site as well. Yeah, so we're just quickly going through how there was a rise and fall about the consumption and the trend of Kashmiri shawls. And what was also very interesting about the consumption of Kashmiri shawls in Europe and America is that they were also worn with muslin dresses, which muslin originates in Bangladesh in an area that would be Bengal, which is now cut in half. Half is in India, West Bengal, another half is in Bangladesh. Okay, so muslin originates in Shanagal, Dhaka, is well documented. Many of the Mughals would wear several layers of this very, very fine cotton. And so muslin is obviously synonymous with a very finely woven cotton. It can be woven anywhere, but Dhaka muslin or Bengal muslin was a particular type that was renowned for centuries. There are notes about it in Roman scripture, about them talking about this woven silk air, dewy air. They always have these very romantic names from Dhaka. And this is an image of Shanagal. This is its 18th century state. It was these buildings from the 18th century. It's crumbling now. It's a heritage site, but it's kind of like decaying in front of your eyes. But yeah, this particular area, Bangladesh itself has such a huge biodiversity. There was a particular type of cottonseed and plant that was only indigenous to Bangladesh that could be spun extremely fine because of the damp conditions, because it's so boggy and wet and mainly a delta. It's just water basically. This particular muslin was able to be woven here. And so these images again in the John Ford Watson's books, as you can see, they're from Dhaka, Bengal. These pretty much are the only surviving examples that we have are in European and Western museums. Bangladesh doesn't have its own museum of historical muslin because it disintegrates and it's damp and there's floods and everything disappears. There's no kind of conservation. It wouldn't be able to conserve these textiles from that far away and that from far long ago. One on the left or right, this is called Jamdani muslin. This is a particular type of technique like brocading, where you create a pattern like embroidery as you're weaving. And these types of muslin cottons, very, very fine cottons, don't exist anymore. The cotton plant that grew in Bangladesh to weave these examples doesn't exist anymore. It's been wiped out. And as we know, there was huge demand for these textiles for the European market, for the muslin dresses in the Regency era, and these have been worn with the Kashmiri shawls. Not so very long after that, cotton then became industrialized in Britain, Indian cotton being sent to the UK, then being spun, woven, sent back to India. And this kind of undercut the hand weavers because it was all done on machines in areas such as Lancashire, where I've done work there. And later on, American cotton picked by enslaved people who had been trafficked to the Americas would have picked the cotton and spun, woven in Britain. So that happened at a similar time and outproduced. So the skills, the knowledge, the plants to grow and weave these examples here don't exist anymore. What we do have is the technique Jamdani, which you can see here. You can see up here really up close, the small blue motif. It's like it's floating. So Jamdani is the surviving example of these textiles, and you can see just how fine it is. The skills to weave textiles this fine don't exist anymore. You won't ever find it woven by hand, spun by hand. So yeah, and here's an image of one of the inside of the books, and this is held in Manchester. So John Ford Watson, he created several volumes, several sets, 9 sets of these books, and sent them to design schools in the UK. I've just got a list of them here. So we had Bradford, Halifax, Huddersfield, Liverpool, London, Macclesfield, Manchester, Preston, Salford, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Belfast, Dublin. And in one of the text that we've sent over for you to look at if you want to, it really describes that some of the textiles that do come out of Manchester and Glasgow are almost direct copies of a lot of these textiles that end up in these books. But yeah, here you can see the kind of systematic way of archiving in a very kind of violent colonial collecting way that takes away agency from artists and designers in South Asia. Okay, so Jamdani today is woven in Bangladesh. It's the only thing that survives from muslin. It's woven on the banks of the Shikalaka River, just outside of Dhaka. Here are some images that are from the Digital Commission we created for Textile Amsterdam. The people there are subsidised by the Craft Council and have their looms in their homes. And it's considered national fabric. Jamdani is the national fabric of Bangladesh, and people are very proud of it. And it is tied up with craft and geography and a kind of heritage textile, and what that means in context to borders and nationalism, because Jamdani and muslin is woven in India as well, in West Bengal. So these very much, there are lots of attachments to the idea of the craft labourer, romanticising the craft labourer as well, and how we view India as a site of craft making and how perhaps we would view Bangladesh. We view Bangladesh as a highly industrialised market, everything to do with the RMG sector, and sewn ready-to-made textiles. We don't think of it as a place, as a site of craft. So subsidising Jamdani textiles and craft makers is a way to reorientate history, textile history, to include Bangladesh in that. Dhaka, but the site of Dhaka, site of Bengal, was where muslin textiles originated. So this is some Jamdani that's been woven today. It's a very modern pattern. Jamdani is literally, it means like a vessel for flowers. It's a Persian word, and it came with the Mughals in the 14th, 15th century. And yeah, so this is cotton that's being spun today. As I said before, indigenous cotton doesn't exist in Bangladesh. They don't grow it, and they don't spin it, and it's not hand spun in any kind of form. There have been newer initiatives to grow that again, but cotton isn't a sustainable crop. We should be encouraging people to grow. Jamdani takes 2 people to weave at the same time. have a video. It's on Vimeo. We don't have to watch it now, but yeah, so you can, maybe I can send you the link and you can watch it in the break or afterwards. Okay, and yeah, maybe we can watch a couple of minutes of it. So talk a little bit about craft and geography and heritage. And I think when we talk about Harris Tweed, for example, we know and can imagine that these are hand-woven textiles woven in the north of Scotland, the Outer Hebrides. It's attached to a geographical imagination of a place that where hand collected dyes from the region would have been used originally. The patterns relating to the people, the place, the geography, and those put together mean that we're more likely to place a value on those textiles, whereas somewhere like Bangladesh and somewhere like muslin, we're less likely to value the craft labour of a place where hasn't been a set up imagination. We think of Bangladesh as kind of a scary, violent, unstable place. We know that India has a lot of industrialization, a lot of the same kind of issues, but that because of colonial narrative, we are more likely to imagine India not as a violent a fascist state, but as a place of romanticized craft and craft labor. So just want to draw attention to those kind of questions around what kinds of value we accrue to different types of laborers, different types of textiles, and the different types of textiles globally. And I think I probably will just stop there because we are having a tiny break. I don't know how long the break is, and then I'll jump into the next half. I can also play the video in the break. Yeah, okay.
কোনো ছেলে বা মেয়ে আপনার সাথে কাজ করে মেয়ে কাজ করে ছেলে মেয়েরা সবাই জানে
Okay, I'm just gonna carry on talking, so maybe you'll join again if you've had a tiny break. Short time. So yeah, so these are two sites of national textiles, as you like, really attributed to the geographies and the areas of these places, where in fact they're romanticized as beautiful garments that were then worn by Western women throughout those eras of the 1800s in the 19th century. We don't think about how those places operate today, and they're both sites of border violence, of civil war, of ethnic conflict. Kashmir as a place, we might have this imagined place of this amazing, beautiful terrain of mountains and lakes and beautiful kind of pastoral weavers and things like that. As a place of political violence, still today people are still fighting, so much for independence and agency from state-sanctioned violence and occupied territories. The Kashmiri textiles becomes not related to its economic realities that's happening today. And the same with borders in Bangladesh. And we have the northeastern border. I don't know if you can see on this map, India wraps around Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a little state. India is quite large. And it's bordered on several sites with Burma and Myanmar. I'm sure a lot of you know about the Rohingya crisis and the borders that create and displace a lot of weavers, indigenous people, and how textiles then become these archives. They become mobile archives. What is the craft geography of displaced people? And often the only things you take with you are your textiles. Kashmiris are some of the biggest diaspora in the world, and often found selling imitation Kashmiri textiles and things like that. Very few looms survive or weavers survive. It's extremely hard, labour-intensive work, mainly done by women in Kashmir. And a lot of, you can see from the video, the jamdani and muslin is woven a lot by men. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the indigenous backstrap weavers who also live in Bangladesh, but on a border. So yeah, this piece of work that I created in 2016 called Warping the Borders, Fringes Fractured. This was at the Whitworth Gallery. And this was a performance that I did in the Whitworth Garden. And I mapped out these sites of borders, colonial violence, of these like place names that created a pre-colonial map of India. And then I drew in with the thread the borders of 1947, and then again the war between East and West Pakistan. I have the video here. And at the end, once I made this kind of textile map embedded into the ground of the Whitworth Garden, I pulled it all out and tangled it up and carried it through the gallery. It's a 5-minute film, and it's interlaced with mine and my mother's voice, about these ideas of nationalism and belonging and independence, and like the divisions that happen between Pakistan, Indian identity, Bangladeshi identity, Bengali identity, Punjabi identity, and all of these things are woven together and create conflict and create division. And it's mainly because of British colonialism that a lot of these tensions exist. Just going to sweep across this film. You can find it online as well. the whitworth. And you can see here's the map being created. And this really uses the idea of the yarn itself. Even before we've woven the yarn, the cotton itself, this was done using hand-spun cotton from Bangladesh, from a project. And the fact that there's so much labour that's gone into the provenance, the growing, the cultivation, the harvesting, the spinning, everything bound up in those threads, even before it's been woven, even before there's been any kind of waste, just kind of really looking at the preciousness of yarn and how this is related to border violence and historical relations in South Asia, in Britain. And this piece very crucially doesn't translate. It's very important that the Bengali text is Bengali, the Bengali spoken word is in Bangla, and the English words are separate. They're two languages interwoven together. It's not a translation. It's for different audiences, and it's for those who can take what they can and what it offers to them if you speak any of those languages. Okay, let's see, pulling it out. Yeah, there's me pulling it out. Okay. And the posts all had inscriptions on them of mapping places and vignettes and in different languages. And the aftermath and the tangledness was created as a kind of like a woven physical embodiment of those border relations. And these are some images from the Whitworth. Yeah, and just talking about Bangladesh being seen as an industrialized centre of waste, not of skill, and this I think is a kind of image that encapsulates a lot of that. And yeah, so talking about the Chakma weavers. So these are two weavers learning to weave on a backstrap loom. And this is completely done by hand. Again, all the threads are picked up by hand. There's no machine involved. The same with the brocade weaving in Kashmir, the Jamdani, all the patterns are memorized by hand. And these are some weavers learning from an alam. An alam is called the Book of Weaving. It's like an alphabet of patterns, or it's like a codex of languages that are an alphabet or sentences that are done pictorially and are held together in this textile format. And so earlier we talked about the John Forbes Watson archives as being a very violent archive, and the idea that we have to collect things and categorize them and cut them up, and that's what John Forbes Watson did. He had all these textiles and he cut up the little samples and he put them all in little books and sent them off and all this kind of stuff. What does it mean to weave something that will disappear? What's the meaning of that textile? Is it the pattern or is it the embodied knowledge? So these woven textiles, these are from an area called Chittagong Hill Tracks. There's a collection of alams. The oldest one there was woven by someone's grandmother, someone's great-grandmother, and she's already 60. And this is all that's left of the patterns. But that way of preserving things is not really about keeping the cloth intact. The cloth gets used, the cloth gets woven. So the patterns exist and are retained from passing from weaver to weaver. We know this, and this is how knowledge gets lost, but it's also about what's the urgency and how we place urgency on collecting things and and collecting things in a certain type of archive. And for here, the archive is the body. The body remembers the patterns. Also, as a result, lots of these are collected by a textile designer that I work with, and he is archiving them, and they are really special, and they should be preserved. But it's also what we place value on, you know, what gets kept and how it gets kept, and who has choice over that. But yeah, these are incredible patterns that sadly don't get woven because there isn't a market for them, even though many people would love to weave them, but they're so labor intensive, and they build the looms from bamboo and things like that. And you can see here some of the women weaving, and I'm weaving with them. And yeah, and these are backstrap looms, so they can be rolled up and they tie to the body, and when you're weaving, the tension weaves with your body, and that's how you relax, and that's how you weave. And when you relax it, there's less tension, you pull it, and you're tied to a post. And so this textile is very much related to your body. It's not something that is outside of the body. It's not something that is done on a machine. It's like you are an extension of that technology. Your body is the technology. And yeah, a little note here, I think I said about the patterns, is a lot of indigenous patterns get lost or are not, they're not for the consumption by non-indigenous people. And so, you know, maybe we shouldn't have the privilege of seeing all these amazing patterns because they're not for us. But often indigenous culture and textile art and textile designs, you know, people will take one thing to consume and replicate it and copy it and consume it, and kind of reduce it. There's like a reduction of the kind of breadth of that kind of catalogue of designs and patterns, and kind of reducing and essentializing and being derivative of the huge breadth of indigenous art, textile design, and how amazing that can be. And this happens in Bangladesh as well. The mainland ethnic Bengalis will say that their Jamdani is better or more technically established or technically difficult or more important than these indigenous woven textiles from the Chittagong Hill Tracts regions. This is a group of chakmas, but there are 13, there could be more. There may be up to 80, it's not been a catalogue thing, different ethnic groups, different languages, different religions, each with their own textile patterns. So there's so much eco-diversity and cultural diversity in those regions that can't be reduced to one thing. And, you know, that's what's happening today. If you're an ethnic religious minority, these textiles are devalued in Bangladesh because it doesn't fit in with the national narrative of Jamdani and Muslim and what it means to be Bangladeshi, and the skills and the technical know-how of Jamdani needs, the state needs to position Jamdani in this way to reflect that kind of nationalism back on itself. And this is how we're looking at the way different textiles get valued, even in the same country, and who that labor might be, who that worker might be, whose art and patterns they might be. Okay, so this is it's just a technique. It's a brocading. It's very simple brocading. It's done by that region. But these are very simple blankets, and you can see the patterns I showed you just before are incredible, you know, really just absolutely incredible and unique. And these are blankets that people make out of recycled wool, and they do a little floating motif, and this is called an extra weft technique. It exists all around the world. It's lots of weavers use it, and it's just like a floating extra weft, which is the horizontal yarn that works when you're weaving, just so it floats, a little floating pattern. So when people see this in Bangladesh, they think, oh, this is a poor man's jamdani. The people here are not very skilled at doing jamdani. They're trying to copy the jamdani, which is not true at all. As you can see, they have their own weaving language that is completely distinct, and it's not that it's undecipherable, it's completely distinct and separate to the language of jamdani. Okay, some of my work. So I use brocading techniques. I use a technique called, I call it an unwoven technique. Yeah, so I like to think about the idea of what it means to create textiles that don't just adhere to perpendicular lines. You know, when we think of weaving, we think of something that is on a grid. The idea of the grid, when Annie Albers talks about the grid and how then when she deviates from the grid as well, the discontinuous and the curved line. I'm very much interested in the tangle. What does it mean to incorporate the tangle? The yarn is still so beautiful. The yarn is still kind of unfurling, and for me, there's a queerness around the tangle. There's a politics around the tangle. It's a refusal to be a commodity. It's a refusal to be a usable textile. You know, something that's put on a wall or put on your bed or whatever, which is perfectly fine. But this idea of commodifying labor, production, the idea of how textiles are valued in the art world. So yeah, it's my unweaving technique. And so you can see here, this is a piece called It Must Be Nice to Fall in Love. And you can see probably the motif is a brocaded image of a map of pre-colonial India. And the borders have been drawn in, but they've been done through this kind of tangled, unwoven technique. And what that alludes to is the fact that these colonial borders are in fact imaginary, even though they're physically and materially enforced through violence and impact people today, but they are warped. They are things that can be distorted. They are they are things that have been imagined. They're things that can be a kind of deception. Yeah, so when this piece was done on the loom, the idea is when something is on the loom and when it's in tension, it's held very tight, and you follow the borders and you follow the lines, the demarcations. But when the weaving comes off the loom, the tension of the fabric changes, and then those borders and those lines and those boundaries change as well. They become malleable. Again, alluding to the fact that weaving is very much grounded in a lot of world making. In a lot of cultures, it's attached to ideas of birth and regeneration, and really this piece was about using maps as a way to world build and referencing textiles. It's using cotton and silk and linen and lots of hand-dyed yarns, but mainly about the fact that these things can be undone and changed, and borders are just as malleable as, or can be destroyed. Let's destroy them. Let's unpick them just as much as this textile can. On the other side is the piece called Amar Desh, my country, my homeland. I can't read the other side. The country, my homeland, my diaspora, my motherland is a memory of unwoven dreams. And the text in this piece is Bengali, and it's woven into a kind of coded pattern. And the final piece has an unwoven warp that goes all the way to the end and then rolls round into a chained warp of silk. And again, just looking at these ideas of when people have this nationalist idea of what it means to be Bangladeshi, like Amar Desh, Bangladesh, and these are really dangerous concepts that don't really help anybody. And especially when you're in the diaspora, you're more likely to romanticize this imagined geographical place of Bangladesh that you wish existed, but it doesn't really. And how even if it's a place that's won its independence through war and suffered a lot, materially suffered a lot, and is still suffering now, and all this kind of things. A nation state and a majority will always oppress the minority, it being indigenous peoples along the border states. Here's some close-ups. It's a piece again where I use Bengali text and I create patterns. This is quite an old piece now in 2013, but it's 19 letters and it's a piece of poetry. And it's picked out in the little red motifs. It's about different types of languages, queer languages, weird ways of seeing, kind of what does it mean to have a coded language of queerness, if you're POC, if you're brown, if you're QT-POC, BIPOC, and how if you're able to read certain languages, having a kind of literacy, you'll be able to read this cloth. So that's that. And this is all done with hand-dyed silks and cotton. And again, this is a very South Asian concept of using cotton and silk together. There's a cloth called mashru. It's cotton on the inside and then silk on the outside, meaning permitted, and that's a cloth that would have been woven by Muslims because silk next to skin wasn't permitted. And it's called Lift the Veil and See Our Silent Language. And again, this is part of some of my unwoven techniques and part of that series of highly patterned brocaded textiles. And for me, instead of using the brocading technique to hide all the threads, I then kind of reversed it and started unfurling the threads and accentuating the tangles and the kind of eruptingness and the disrupting the surface of textiles. We think of woven cloths as being a kind of 2D surface or a 3D surface, but something that has to be straight, and these make them more 3D. Okay, so some of my performances deal with looking at Lancashire, there's a massive South Asian diaspora in Lancashire, mainly the textile mills that got created to weave and spin cotton from India and from America to then be sold back to India, then became places where they needed labour in the 50s and 60s, post-colonial, post-war, and a lot of people from border regions like Kashmir, like Sylhet in Bangladesh, where their livelihoods had been destroyed and they couldn't work anymore across the border, were encouraged to come to Lancashire, and people are settled there today. We're looking at East Lancashire, West Yorkshire, Burnley, Blackburn, Accrington, Oldham. These are all satellite Manchester towns where people came to work in the textile industries. We're talking about 1950s, 60s, 70s, even as late as the 80s. And this textile piece is kind of about that, kind of mapping these disparate kind of textile cotton links that kind of warp across time and space and generations. And conversely, we have a South Asian diaspora that went to go work in the mills that would have displaced their own indigenous textile heritage and cultures back in Kashmir and Bangladesh. Yes, this is a kind of performance about that, where I built a loom and made a warp and then cut it. And it's using lots of spools, from factories and cotton, and made these little sculptures. Okay, and this is a piece from 2017. This is where also in my practice I build looms. So I build backstrap looms, I build frame looms, I've also built ground looms, warp weighted looms. So it's one of my looms where I built a massive frame. It was bigger than me. It was called The Body is a Site of Resistance. The body is a site of production. Resist, resist, resist. And this is part of a larger installation looking at non-Western forms of production, weaving, disrupting again the site of production with this kind of tangle. Again, what does it mean to do lots of weaving but then not produce a cloth? You know, what is an anti-colonial cloth? What is something that the disabled body, what can the disabled body produce? Is it that we are obsolete because we can't function? What does it mean to function under capitalism? What does it mean? What does craft and textiles mean? Associated with the brown body, the labour, the worker, the fact that so much of our fashion and textile industry, we make things constantly only for things to be thrown away and destroyed. You know, it's this kind of futile labour that is kind of destroying us. Some books. It's this amazing book called Non-European Looms that I found somewhere online. I can't remember it. I just ordered it from some random bookshop or something, and there's actually a few that exist more. I didn't really think about where it was from, and then looked at it, and it's actually a catalogue of non-European looms in this museum, the Bankfield Museum in West Yorkshire, which is where a lot of my work is taking place, in East Lancashire, things like this. And they've got looms from all over the world, and they just are in this strange museum. I don't know why they're there, and I've tried to talk to the museum and they don't know why they were there, but there's a catalogue that has all these amazing drawings of these non-Western looms. So I build looms out of my own body, and this is me weaving with a kind of loom attached to my mouth and my foot. And here's a close-up of body as a site of production. Okay, so another piece called You and I Are More Alike. And this is a loom that I built between two people. In this one, it's my mother and one of my very good friends. I lay down a paper and I have people wear these shirts, and the shirts are connected by a warp, and then I weave between them, and then the threads are loose and hit the paper, and then I draw the loose threads. And then when the people move, what's left, you don't know what is thread and what has been drawn. And I take notice of the steps, and we move across the paper. And I did this again at Raven Row with two friends of mine. And this piece is about the kind of shared collective trauma we might share with people we don't even know. And the fact that our bodies are archives, we have intergenerational trauma, we have so many collective histories and connections with people that we don't even perhaps tap into or even know about, but we carry them in our body. And we're actually connected to each other all the time through this. And this is what this piece is about two femmes of colour holding each other together. And the way this warp works, the way this loom works, is looms only work when they're in tension. And for this loom to be in tension, it's held with the participant's breath. So the only way that the loom stays taut is that the two participants have to breathe together. They can't see each other, but they can feel each other, and they can know each other. They know each other are there, and that it's the breath that holds them together. And they know that they have to keep that tight. And it's kind of this little tug, and that enables me to weave between them. And you know, it's really quite an arduous process for the participants, and I look after them and give them water and food. You know, I do drawing around them. But it really is a performance of this album of like the kind of invisibilized labor, the kind of erased labor of femmes of color and Black women and brown women, and the kind of shared relationships and traumas and histories that are intertwined and connected to us that we don't necessarily always know that we're carrying that around with us, and we're kind of connected to each other that way. Some more images. And here's the aftermath. So you can see the drawings and the threads. And then the silk shirts that are then dropped. I've got shuttles and I grind spices and there's a lot of smells. And then there's this kind of leftover paper map of these human traces of the performance that, that I really love. This mortar and pestle and mortar, I don't know how to call it, is my mother's, and it looks like a baseball bat. And like actually was in a museum at the weekend where there was this Stone Age or something, Iron Age. I don't know which one is the mortar and the mortar of the pestle, but the kind of pestle shape, the vessel, and it looked exactly like the one my mum has. And yeah, and I really love that. The first performance I did doing that one was with my own mother. Okay, here's a loom that I built with my own feet. So again, looking at tension and looking at migration and dance and ideas of Indian identity and what does it mean to be Bengali or Bangladeshi. I don't know if it's if many people know or think about Northwestern hegemony. When people think of Bollywood, a lot of fair-skinned people who look very white almost. There's a massive kind of colorism, casteism issue in India, South Asia, Bangladesh, also linked to class, but also how people in the diaspora arrange themselves or think about themselves. And Bengali, Bangladesh people especially are really looked down upon. And these red markings on the feet are using alka, which is a red dye used in Indian national dance, but it actually originated in the region of Bengal, but it's now so part of this like Hindu Indian identity of dance or weddings that if someone's raised their hand, is that fine? Do people need a break or something? Yeah, so it's the red paint on the feet. So this was part of a performance called Build Me a Loom Off Your Back and Your Stomach. This is one of the physical textile pieces that was part of the performance, which was on a loom. I tied a loom to myself, I danced with the loom, and I'm wearing the altar on my feet. And so I carried this loom through the gallery space. It was part of the exhibition called Beyond Borders. And again, it's the unweaving technique you can see on the loom. So I pulled this loom, I wore the gungra, these are the dancing bells. And there's a dance, I danced with the loom, literally carrying the kind of labor-making device on my back. And then this is the loom that I made. And to make this loom, I had to pierce the skin of my feet. and it was held in tension by my entire body. And in order to weave with this loom, you need to hold the tension just right. But if you pull it too tight, you'll break your skin. So it really was a very intimate and sensitive and delicate performance. And, you know, I kind of like drew everyone, you know, closer to me in order to do it. You know, we all had to sort of be in the space together, this kind of very affective, a lot of affect, a lot of kind of like visceral kind of collective performance. Oh, I got a picture of me actually doing it with everyone. No. Okay. So yeah, so this is where it was held between the feet. And yeah, and this is the loom afterwards. So there's lots of rope and lots of chains. And really just this piece came out of everything that I'm talking about, ideas of borders, migration, partition. 1947, you know, people had to move, people had to leave their homes, people had to leave long distances. Maybe they took textiles with them, maybe they left everything behind and it got burnt. People were murdered, people were killed. So this was, you know, a kind of dance embodying a lot of these histories, and how textiles are really part of those histories and what we take with us, and the kind of pain and the kind of things that are held within us. This tiny loom between my feet. Okay, so some newer pieces that are actually being shown in London this week. It's a performance I did at Cove Park in Scotland, and again this idea of building looms, and I got really interested in warp-weighted looms. It's a very historical, ancient way of weaving. It's found mainly in Northern Europe, Scandinavian countries, things like this, and all over the UK. And I was really interested in maybe creating them, and the loom weights are usually, they all have to be the same size. No, they all have to be the same size. Yeah, it's the same thing. They all have to be the same size, and usually made out of terracotta, and you find them in archaeological sites, things like this. So I created a sea loom for this performance. I can play it a tiny bit for you. But it's actually made out of rocks from the sea, and then I threw the rocks into the sea, as you can see here. And then I was weaving with my body. And this is a piece called Nil Nargis Blue, Bringing the Tide with Your Moon. And this came out of a lot of research looking at indigo, histories of indigo plantations in Bengal, looking at jute production in Dundee, in Calcutta, the relationship between linen and slavery, and linen production in Scotland. And the idea of weaving with water as a material, and the kind of unknowable depths and violences of water. There's an area in Scotland called Coolport where the MOD keep their nuclear weapons. So we have nuclear warheads that run through this water. So yeah, looking at displacement, embodied landscapes, the kind of geographies of weaving where you're connecting with the land and your body, and how this type of weaving kind of creates a bridge between that. Yeah, so here's the warp-weighted loom, as it usually is, and I was experimenting with that. Yeah, and this year I've been doing a lot of research, and did a lot of research on indigo history in Bangladesh, and I'm working with indigo that's being grown there ethically. That's a whole other lecture. And yeah, flax production in the Baltic and Dundee in Europe, and really thinking about it as a sustainable material. This is more from the performance. And so this has been made into a film. It was shown at the Delhi Art Fair, Indian Art Fair in Delhi this year. And then, you know, in January, before everything happened. It's being shown in London for the next 3 weeks. Yeah. I'm just going to end with these images from some work that I've been doing in Lancashire. So actually in the mill of these textile, cotton, spinning, weaving factories, I was able to do a performance with waste yarn fabrics from a local textile mill called John Spencer Textiles in Lancashire, in Burnley, and created this kind of installation addressing everything that I've talked about in this lecture. And it's a really amazing experience to kind of be inside the museum and build an installation with all this kind of industrial equipment. And I think what my work is about referencing industrial textile history and looking at perhaps how to create crafted objects or crafted moments of the body within those sites. And I definitely think my body in these spaces does disrupt them. If I'm in a gallery space and using kind of my body and making things and, you know, making things that are not permanent and are very kind of like tangled and not they're not quiet. Yes, there's another type of kind of warp weighted loom used with real warp weights that would have been used on an industrial loom. Yeah, and in the 80s, a lot of these looms, you know, just got thrown away as trash because the British textile industry completely collapsed. Yeah, and I'll end that there.
Thank you so much, Raisa. That was so interesting. I'm not sure if my video is coming up.
It is, yeah.
It is, okay. I can't see myself. Thanks so much. That was really wonderful. We have questions from the audience, which is really wonderful. So I'll start with a question from Natsuko Motegi. It says, I truly appreciate your intentions of your work and carefully crafted meanings of your art and the process of creating these meanings in art. What disposition do you wish for the viewers to have? What do you hope for the viewers when they create their own meanings as they see your work?
I think, you know, you'll talk to any artist, you have to let go of the work. You know, people will take different things from it. And this is why I don't tend to really explain that much. I think it's really great to have an in-depth talk with me and I can explain things further. But I know friends who maybe have a South Asian heritage and saw my performance. I didn't have to explain it to them. They just got it. It just hit them. And I think, you know, my work will speak to the people it's meant to speak to and will ask people to ask more questions for those where they want to be inquisitive and want to learn more. And I think every performance I do, I create a tangible piece. And it's like, you know, I work between areas of impermanence and kind of textile crafted object that won't last forever, but it's my works, you know, are of a moment. If people are in the performance with me, they get to share that with me, and I hope that like me creating that space creates a space for them to maybe interrogate what they're seeing and how they're absorbing the work. But yeah, my position is to not be prescriptive or dictatorial, but yeah, just ask questions.
And I'm really curious how, because you when you build these looms, or what does the practice or this work of building the looms give you that's different from well, yes, just that really. Why build the looms yourself?
So I really feel that in our modern day world, in our kind of post-industrial West, we are so removed from sites of industrial production. We don't understand how things are made. We don't understand about the processes and the tools. And I'm also very interested in the tools. It's not just the textiles, it's also the machinery. And that performance for Build Me a Loom, that performance called the body as a site of production, that was a 10-hour performance where I built the loom, then built the frame, added the nails, and then I warped it up, and then I put the tapestry in, and then I was weaving in it, you know, for 10 hours. And I think for me, it's about bringing these intensive labor processes into art gallery spaces, and to also reference art labor production. You know, it's not only about textile history, it's also about me as the artist creating this, you know, to be consumed in an art gallery. And we never really question the value of that kind of labor as well. For me, it is about the idea of craft labor and bringing that into a gallery. And that's why I built the looms. And for me, even the process of building it with people, and sometimes you know, I have participants, people can weave with me. It's about the process of the making rather than making a finished blanket or something. It's about those bodily processes and industrial processes. And we often think about them really separately. We don't think of the machine next to the person that's operating the machine, that's weaving the thing that we bought in a shop, or that we're wearing, you know. So I think it's about edging towards the machinery in order to kind of bring us closer to this far-flung labourer that we don't really conceptualize.
Perhaps a little bit, I think, an extension or of that question. There's a question from Rachel who says, you mentioned a few times that looms and weaving only works in tension. What do you think changes about these works once they exist off the loom? Do they rest? And what is the relationship between labor and non-labor, on and off?
On and off loom?
Well, it's a, what is the, I think maybe answer, what is the relationship between labor and non-labor, and the, and how the weavings exist off the loom?
Yeah, because I think sometimes we think of textile feminist art as, you know, some idle Victorian women who did some embroidery. You know, is that labour? Is that work? And I guess my work is about creating a kind of different angle about what is textile art, what is a feminist textile art practice that includes women of colour, that includes people of colour, that includes global art practices where weaving is, you know, the weaving that I've seen across the globe, the kind of techniques, the skill, the practices is on a whole other scale to what you see, you know, that's handwoven and has originated from the West. But when we think about feminist textile art, it tends to be rooted in these forms of, you know, soft, slow work of domestic. And I'm trying to be like, actually, things that are crafted are not just domestic, they're actually people's livelihoods, and actually the oscillating between what's industrial and what's craft, and how, you know, for some people they become the tool, they become industrialized. I never really want to romanticize craft labourers. It's really hard work. It's really, weaving's really, really tough on the body, and it's not an easy thing to do. But yeah, so tension on the loom, the cloth, and this is why some of my pieces are left on a kind of frame, because it is about that tension. And what you could see about one of my performances is with the bodies, it's in tension, with you and I more alike. And then when the bodies are absent, the cloth is just on the floor, and it's just kind of like a bit like a puddle, and it's kind of like the remnants of, you know, what happens when the body is removed. And that's the same as like the textile on and off tension. Like, we don't think about the textile once it's off the loom and it's been sent somewhere. It's also removed from its maker and the body of the person who made it. So yeah, I think it's all really interesting, and tension is a big thing that I play with, and I'm very interested when things do come off tension, because they change and they warp and they become messy. And yeah, it's about playing with tension and playing with rigidness. Yeah.
There's another question from April who says, I'm an interdisciplinary artist who's also working with educators and young children. I'm very interested in the body as a disruptive site and wonder if you've looked into any histories of child labor in regards to textile production and how this subjected children's bodies.
Yeah, no, completely. I mean, I grew up in Manchester. Like we were taught very early on about the children that worked in the textile mills who update, they started very young. And, the word dobby loom. So dobby loom is a type of loom where you have more than 16 shafts, that then is a derivative of the draw boy. Because it literally, in order to lift the shaft before you had the jacquard loom, you'd have a little boy who would sit at the top of the loom and lift the threads. So yeah, and I think, we know that there's a lot of child labour that happens all around the world in very embodied techniques and things like that. There's less, there's child labour to do with weaving in terms of like, if it's a cottage industry where you have whole families who, the mum will do the starching or the warping, and then the kid will come home from school and do a little bit. Yeah, there's a huge history of that. I haven't done any personal work on it. I think my work tends to maybe cover all of that. But in terms of like exploitation, yeah, there's a huge histories of it. I think what's interesting is the kind of exploitation in textile, the industrialization textile making in the 18th and 19th century in the UK included a lot of child labour, and how those models enabled Britain to make a lot of money by exploiting their own working class, using slave pick cotton, and also selling it back to a colonial country. It's like, these types of profits are not usual. Somebody has to be exploited in order to make these huge profits. I don't know if anyone here has ever been to Manchester, but there are huge warehouses, huge mansions. It's like a huge influx of money that's time stamped in all the architecture and all the names. You look at the kind of museums that have been left over and stuff like that, and it's like, of course there has to be children exploited in order to kind of create that amount of wealth, and how that happens in these kind of post-colonial countries that have no other way to emulate these kind of profits or ways of economies. I like to think in Bangladesh a lot has been done to support child workers, but it is a fact of life. It's lots and lots of poor kids, people without mums, and people who need to work, and it is a fact of life there. It's awful, but yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we're getting very close to 6:30. I'm not completely sure if this webinar will cut off. I don't think so, but so I think we should try to go for one last question before we say goodbye for tonight. So there's a question from Anne who asks, how she'd love to know more about how you feel during these performances. So how it feels really to be the performer. So how do you feel when you're embodying these moments? How is your feeling, and how have people reacted to the works? So actually it's two questions. Is the expression connected to a movement? So the connection to the sea, the water. I think this maybe, I also have a question, but no, let's just stay with Anne's question for now.
Okay, well, well, I have a lot of chronic illnesses. I used to have a lot of pain. A lot of these are kind of self-managed at the moment. But a lot of these works span, past 5 years, 6 years. There were times when I did performances, especially Warping the Borders, one where I was in the garden. I made the posts too short. So when I had to dip down to wrap the yarn around the post, I basically had to squat. So it was like doing 20 squats in like 1 hour, but 20 squats each revolution. So probably like 300 squats, I don't know. And I couldn't walk the day afterwards. I couldn't walk at all. It was so intensive. It had such a toll on my body. but it also was this huge release when I pulled all those threads out of the ground. And I think these kind of performances are meant to heal. They're meant to make you feel like you're healing something inside yourself, and that's when you know it's working. You know, even though it did cause me a lot of pain, I think practically I try and make performances where I'm not extending my body, you know, extending my boundaries. I mean, you know, make sure I eat, make sure I don't do too much, look after myself. But the performances themselves are meant to be these kind of transformative spaces, especially if I'm working with other people. You know, I do lots of like collaborative performances that I don't show here because they're part of institutions or working with young people. You know, I build looms with young people and we become the loom, or, you know, we do all sorts of things where we become the warp and the weft. And these are just transformative spaces where we're looking at weaving as a type of thinking, as a type of methodology to think about collectiveness and like, what does it mean to like be intentional? What does it mean to create something together? And how weaving can be this kind of, transformative way of thinking about the world. So yeah, was there another question?
I think that's a wonderful place to end, really, weaving as a transformative force in the world.
Yes. Okay,
Thanks
great.
so much, Raisa, for this really incredibly powerful talk. If it's okay, I'm just going to do a tiny bit of PR for our next events. If anyone is interested in hearing more, we have, especially tomorrow, a workshop with US artist and activist Misha Cardenas. It's called Textiles in Resistance, and it is a workshop to learn how to use textiles against violence. So in a quite an interesting way, I think, related to some of the things we've heard today. I think I will just say we also have a another talk on the 16th of September with Lisa Pareitzer, who is a UK-based and London-based psychoanalyst and cultural theorist, and the talk will be about care and violence, care, time, and violence. And there's a lot of projects and beautiful artwork available on our website www.altcph.dk. You can also read more about Raisa's work there. Thank you so much to everyone who came tonight. It was really a pleasure to have you all here. And thank you again, Raisa, for being with us and for telling us in depth about all your really wonderful and important work.
Thank you.
Thank you. And for everyone, this talk will be online. I think within a few days, maybe a week, but keep an eye on all of our social media.
Yeah, definitely. And my performance that I was sharing before, it's on Indigo and Madder in London, in Deptford. If you want to see it, it's on until the 26th of September. Just thought I'd put that in there. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Raisa. Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
Bye.
Bye.